to the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills we need to build healthy relationships with others. Our show today will deal with the topic of grieving and loss as a result of the pandemic. Much of the material that we will be talking about is based upon the Rainbows program and the support group called Rainbows, who is the founder of is Susie Marta.
So, as Tom said, today we're going to talk about how to engage with family and friends, and particularly with children, around grief and loss. Neither of us is an expert in the field, but we have studied it in order to help clients navigate around loss, and we'd like to share what we've learned. So, when you think of grief, you may think of the big stroke, brushstroke things like a death, a divorce, a loss of a job, sometimes even a daughter or son growing up and moving away. Even though that has a happy aspect to it, it still has loss. But during this time, this pandemic, we are all experiencing some kind of loss. Mm-hmm. We've lost access to our friends. We've lost the freedom to move around and to travel and to mingle in public. We've lost our sense of safety and security and our wellness even. We've lost a sense of control. Some of us have lost income. We've lost our predictable routines. We've lost our colleagues because many people can't work in person. We can't eat out. And a lot of people have lost the culmination of milestones like weddings and graduations and proms and sporting events and championships and entertainment. I mean, the list goes on. But we've even lost that sense of touch because so much of our world is virtual now. Mm-hmm.
So what do people, Marsha, need to understand about this grieving process, specifically around the phenomena of the pandemic?
Well, first of all, just that it's a process. Mm-hmm. Grieving loss anytime is a process, and especially now too, because we're all feeling it at the same time. I think that's what amplifies it. So understanding that it is a process is extremely important, because we can't help others if we don't understand that there are stages, mm-hmm. and we also can't help if we ourselves are overwhelmed. There are various stages that are somewhat predictable, and everybody's journey through it is unique.
So why don't we get into, but what are those stages,
right,
and
so,
how many of them are there?
It really depends on whose model and whose framework you look at. But mm-hmm. in 1969, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was accredited with the classic original model, and it was 5 stages. And it was denial, anger, mm-hmm. bargaining, depression, which we mostly associate with grief, just that sadness, mm-hmm. and then acceptance. Mm-hmm. There are other models that break up some of those systems into stages, into sub-stages, but that's the classic framework.
So how would I know if I'm experiencing this grieving, what stage I might be in, or what stage my child might be in?
Well, no matter which framework you look at, they all start with shock and denial, because this has happened to you, and it is often from the blue. You didn't expect it, and you can't believe that it's happening. Mm-hmm. So no matter what you're looking at, whether it's a 5-stage, 7-stage, 8-stage, 10-stage. And that gives you a little bit of time to get your feet under you, and it protects you while you're kind of relaxing into the fact that it's really happening. You might move from there to anger, because you're reacting. Once you acknowledge that it is happening, you are angry and you want to retaliate against the person or the situation that has caused this, because mm-hmm. you want to act. It's a natural reaction to want to do something mm-hmm. to counter this experience. Then you might go into bargaining, which is like how can I make this not be happening? Right?
What do I need to do?
When it's an interpersonal thing, you might like negotiate with the person and try to show you're changing. Interestingly enough, during the pandemic, the people who are talking about these stages of grief overlaid with the COVID, people bargain by selecting and suppressing certain information that will coincide with what they need at the moment. So they can convince themselves that maybe it's not happening according to the information that they let in.
Would that be also being real loyal to a particular way of thinking or a particular person?
It can even shift, because you see in bargaining that people are not static. You know, they'll offer something. You know, some people say, well, I will do anything, just let this not happen, or but then they may change. So it may vacillate. So you've got like, I can't believe this is happening, to like, I'm angry, to what can I do to maybe not make this happen, to sadness and depression, which is what people usually equate with grief and loss.
Right.
That's the stage that they recognize, and they assume that the whole process is about being sad. So you're kind of present with it. It's an important stage because you kind of have to feel this mourning, loss, in order to move on to doing something about, like, okay, now what? And accepting the new normal, the circumstances that you're in, and trying to kind of pick up the pieces and recreate a future, whatever that is.
Isn't that one of the typical signs that you're getting into that stage, is beginning to think in terms of the future rather than the past and what's happening?
And trying to struggle your way out of it. You're like, you've accepted and you're planning, and you are forward thinking and adapting. Now, you know, when we're talking about kids, sometimes people insert other things, like they feel guilty, they might be ill, they are confused, but these are this basic scaffolding of the processes of grief. Now, in terms of moving through this, again, everybody has their own process and own journey, but in this situation, it could take adults months to move through to acceptance. And depending on the lack of the degree of the impact as well. You know, if somebody has suffered some of these loss of mobility things, it might be easier. But if you've lost your job, you might rebound when another job opens or when you're called back to work. But if the family has suffered financial ramifications, it may be compounded by anxiety and having to change your standard of living and so many other things. And kids can get triggered by this. And what they're finding is that even though these stages of grief might apply pretty smoothly to adults, kids, because they don't have the life experiences and they don't read social cues, and they make leaps of faith and assumptions about things, that they don't flow through it the same way. And sometimes they need some support to get through it.
Right. They just don't have the cognitive ability
they don't.
To figure it out.
And they do the best they can, putting together things, but they just don't have, as you say, the cognitive experience to make the same deductions. And often they don't have the power either, because the adults are in the role of deciders, and so they're kind of at the mercy of whatever the experience is. So I would say that the big takeaway about grief is it's more than sadness. It's multifaceted. There are different stages. It's normal to have all of the variety of feelings, from sadness to anger to trying to figure out how it could maybe not be true, to the initial shock. It's normal. You may not feel that way when you're going through it. And that everybody's going to have a different experience.
I think, too, that especially with the pandemic, that sort of a universal thing. As you mentioned, parents are going through this as well as their children.
At the same time, right.
It's not as if they're okay and they just have to help their children. They also are working with this.
And we see, the homeschooling, home working, and all of the extra layers. It ratchets up the anxiety and tension. You may be trying to bring your best self, but your best self doesn't show up every day.
Right. So I think that kind of the words I think of in terms of sort of a universal response to this is frustration and fear. Just too much of the unknown, and the consequences are pretty severe for this.
I think also some people feel bad. They feel badly about their loss when it doesn't seem as bad as somebody else's loss. Like I feel a little guilty that I miss getting together with my friends, but I still have my health. But that is still a loss. And it's a legitimate feeling. So you also have that, like, is it okay to feel bad about this?
A lot of turmoil, different types of feelings.
That I don't see people, or that I can't travel.
Right. Yeah, and how do I relate
alive,
to them?
I'm not ill, but I have my job, but I still have I'm diminished in other ways. So
let's take a look at some of the concerns that children might state. And by children, I'm talking about young children and preteens, or teens, early teens. So kids in this age range would often say, why did this happen?
Right.
They want an answer to that. And will it happen again? They want that assurance.
Is this going to be permanent?
Yes, right. What if my friends and relatives or parents get the virus? Then what? Will I be separated from my family and my friends? This is the part of the isolation of this, working with this pandemic, has been to stay away and to stay isolated. Why do I feel so alone? Or even, why do I feel the way I do without even being able to identify what it is? But it's a very uncomfortable
disruptive
feeling. And am I safe? That's one of the most basic needs we have. So when someone fears whether or not they're safe, that's pretty critical.
And that's very delicate because we don't always have control over that.
That's
but
right.
Yet you want to reassure your children, but not so that they'll be risky. That's a really tricky path to walk.
Exactly, depending on the age of the child.
I don't want to overpromise that you are unconditionally safe.
Yeah.
I don't want to scare you, but I also don't want you to take chances. So that's hard.
So who can keep me safe? A child might be asking. And one that you mentioned, is this crisis permanent? Are we always going to be wearing face masks?
Because the younger the child is, the less likely they are to get out of that moment.
And their sense of time
is very
different. Yes. Are my parents going to be okay? Here a child is leaning on parents for support and worrying at the same time, is that going to be there for them? Will we have enough money to eat and to keep our house or our apartment with it? That's an awful burden for a child to be trying to burden or to carry out. When can I go back to school?
I know.
And if I go back, will I be safe?
And what about my teacher? If you've made a connection with other adults in your life that you've been separated from, you have anxiety about them as well.
Sure. If you go to a class and they say, well, your teacher is absent for today, it used to be, okay, so she's absent for the day or he's absent. But now it's, do they have the virus? So it's more of a fear response. And a child also might see something on TV, and I saw all those sick people on TV. Is that going to happen to us? So that causes parents to have to be vigilant about leaving that TV
the consumption of news, particularly age appropriate.
The news just keeps repeating it, and a child doesn't have, as we said, the sense of time. So it looks like it's happening over again, or more people are dealing with it, rather than this is a repeat of what they said an hour ago. So that really needs to be limited. And if the child is going to be in the room where the news is going and they're discussing this, a parent really should be there to help the child interpret things and also catch any fear reaction that the child might show.
Right. So if you're moving into older children, it can be the social aspect, because
Yes.
they have other people in their lives other than just you. It's like, well, how am I going to hang out with my friends? And then you have also kind of interacting with these bubbles of like, well, what are your friends' rules? And
Yes.
having to negotiate those different power struggles between little pods of people. If you're in a romantic relationship as a teenager, this is not a great time for you either. Like, how am I going to date or, do stuff? How will I hang out? I want to belong, and how am I going to belong in this? There's anxiety about academics, for students that are motivated and driven for that. Like, am I going to be okay? Am I going to get into college? Am I going to finish my studies? Maybe there are all different kinds of learning styles right now and blended learning teams, but it may be good for some kids, but this may not be an easy way to learn for other kids.
They lose the social aspect of that learning, don't they?
Yeah, and the hands-on,
Yes.
and the peer learning as well. And then again, they saw what happened last year in the spring about, my prom, my graduation, the championship game, am I going to be able to play sports? All of these expectations and things that they were looking forward to are up in the air. What's going to happen with that? And what about higher education? Am I going to go to college in the fall? It's all suspended.
Yeah.
And am I going to be stuck here in this house?
For a teenager, that's quite
particularly as
a burden.
winter comes. We've had a little bit of freedom now in the warm weather, but so that could be it too.
I'd like to take a moment to show a demonstration, actually, that comes from the Rainbows organization on how to explain to a child what is happening to them and why it's so sometimes overwhelming, and what can they could do and you do to help them. To do this demonstration, you need some water, a bowl, and bleach, and some food coloring. So what we're going to do, and Marsha, maybe you can help me with this thing, is when a child is beginning to raise some questions, some worries, some fears, this is going to represent their mind, the way they're thinking, and these are the worries, the fears that are coming into that mind. So some of them might be, what were some that we talked about?
What's going to happen to Grandma and Grandpa, and why can't I see them? And am I safe? And why don't we have the food that we usually have? Or I want to see my friends.
So we can see that as all these worries begin to flood the brain, you can see what happens here.
It just permeates
it permeates everything,
yeah.
yes. So does that mean that the child is stuck with this and can't do anything about it? No. We can help the child, and the way we do help them is to encourage them and show them how to express their feelings and to talk about it. This is part of the antidote for clearing this up. And we're going to use the bleach to represent that. So the bleach is actually coming in. This is the soothing, the reassurance, the allowing the child to talk about the things.
And explaining what's going on the best you can, with age-appropriate descriptions.
Yes.
And allowing the child or the teen to ask questions. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we've talked about before with active listening, reflective listening.
So all this is going into this brain now.
Yeah. And if they're younger, maybe you could draw pictures, or you could use other stories that they're familiar with to demonstrate what's going on. Remind them that they're loved, and listen without judgment. And don't discount their fears, but share your own feelings in an age-appropriate, sensitive way.
Okay, so when we've poured enough of that support into them, let's see what begins to happen. And we can show our child that, look at this.
It's not as bad as it was.
Yeah, the worries are still there, but they don't have anywhere near the clouding and the flooding effect on the brain, because this is beginning to clear enough that we can think better. So,
and if you were able to continue to offer helpful behavior and attention, maybe you could even clear it up even further.
That's right. This builds resilience for a child.
Being able to identify feelings, we've talked about this in other shows.
Yes, right.
Is so important, and to help them be able to do that. And there's also a concern right now with all the personal protective equipment that a skill is being impaired and not fully developed because kids don't have that. And what I'm noticing now is that even though we've stopped adding the help and the compassionate caring, there's still a residual clearing.
It's still
still happening, even though I'm not actively, because I was able to offer some help there. So the remedial effects are still going.
So it's really important during this time to acknowledge your child's feelings and validate them. Don't say things that would make your child begin to feel that maybe I shouldn't be feeling this way, or that's silly, or you need to be strong and so forth, which just puts the child into more distress.
Because they would say, well, so it's not okay to feel what I'm feeling.
Right. Yeah. It's also good as a parent to be able to share to some extent that you too can feel some of these feelings. So one way to expand that vocabulary of feelings for the child is to, with magazines, to show them pictures and asking the child, what do you think this person in this picture is feeling? And then another way is to watch a show together on television or have a video that you're watching, and again ask, what do you think this person is feeling? A parent can model this by saying throughout the day, this is what I'm feeling with it. So the child begins to hear more and more feelings that can describe more accurately what they are experiencing. So they need to know what is being done also to protect them. So that's a time when you can explain why we are wearing the masks, even why we are making some masks. Many of us are actually manufacturing them. And when you see regressive behaviors of your child, resorting back to earlier development stages, that's not a time to begin to criticize them for that.
I'm just saying, because their capacity has been diminished in some way, and they're retreating to that. Just comfort, I think. Comfort.
If you begin to hear your child say things that sound very disturbing, self-harming, or they're just giving up, or I could just kill myself, but they seem to have meaning to that, that's a time to get some extra help for that with it. But the main thing that even in the organization that I've mentioned here, the important point they wanted to mention is you cannot go wrong in listening, just listening. You don't have to be a psychologist or a counselor to do good listening, but listen to what the child is talking about. Restate for the child. We talked about that in just communication. Restate what you're hearing from the child so the child can hear it coming back and either say, yes, that's what I'm experiencing, or adjusting
They can verify it or not.
Yes,
and I would say
and then
that
validate it.
We've been talking mostly in terms of our relationship with children, but these are good tools to have with anybody in their grieving process, COVID related or not. And I think even as adults sometimes, because we don't always understand the whole stages thing, that we just think it's sadness. And so we want to take away that person's sadness or soothe their sadness. And we can say things that are not helpful. So again, that listen, even an adult to adult who's suffering a loss, it gives you an idea, it gives you information of where are they in this process.
Right. And to be patient, because we've talked about the fact that most of us as we grieve will recycle through these.
So, it may not be linear.
Yes, it's not going to be linear for many of us. So if our partner becomes very impatient with us and said, wait a minute, I thought we were done with this stage with it, that isn't going to help. Generally, I think it's fair to say that when we recycle into a stage, especially as adults, we probably will go through that stage much faster the second time or third time with it than the first.
The first, yeah. And so just keep in mind, lots of stages of grief to be aware of for yourself, for the adults in your world, particularly the kids who are learning. You know, this is a teaching moment for them to figure out how to move through this time and for the future. Be aware, we've got shock and denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and hopefully acceptance of moving on. So we appreciate you joining us again for the Relationship Toolbox, and we look forward to seeing you again to talk about building the tools to be together in community.